Selamat siang dan sore semuanya. Hello everybody and thank you for joining us for Dekat-Dekat Jauh. On behalf of Santy Saptari Art Consulting and Asialink Arts at the University of Melbourne, I would like to welcome you to our final conversation of this series on Australia-Indonesia relations through the lens of visual arts. My name is Pippa Dixon and I'm the Director of Asialink Arts, and I would like to acknowledge the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations in Naarm, where the University of Melbourne is located, as well as the Palawa and Pakana peoples in Lutruwita, Tasmania, where I'm working from today. I pay my respects to elders and leaders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations peoples across the Asia Pacific where we work. First Nations people are some of the most resilient people in the world, and it is our great privilege to be here. So just some housekeeping today. We are recording this session. I know that many of you have your cameras off, but please do feel free to turn them on so that we can feel like we are connected and in the same room together, although I note that quite a few people are having technical or internet speed issues today, and that's also fine. We'd like you to keep your camera on, as I said, if you can, and we will have your sound off. Please do feel free to use the chat, but once we start, please do keep the chat to questions if possible, and that will enable us to filter through those and ask those questions from time to time to our speakers today. Dekat-Dekat Jauh is a four-part conversation series born from concerns that Santy Saptari and I started discussing in 2019 in relation to the level of shared knowledge of our respective visual arts and the broader visual arts ecology in which Australia and Indonesia operate. The three previous conversations have explored this ambitious theme from cross-sectoral perspectives of well-known identities in the arts, business, tourism and government sectors, to name a few, to less heard voices and leaders committed to their professions which in some way connect to and shape the arts ecosystem. Dekat-Dekat Jauh builds on the great work of many individuals and institutions in Australia and Indonesia, aiming to contribute to thought leadership, new insights, stronger connections, and increased capability in our bilateral relations. Santy Saptari is going to commence the conversation today and introduce the speakers. So it's my pleasure to hand over to Santy.
Thank you, Pippa. And a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And I would like to start by welcoming and introducing our lineup of speakers. And I'm very excited because today it's pretty special. We have 5 of them. While I'm reading out their bio, feel free to actually look at their full bios available in the chat box. So I would like to first welcome Penny Burtt. Penny, welcome. And thank you for your time.
Santy, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Yes, we are very delighted to have you today. Penny Burtt is the CEO of Asialink Group. And Penny is a former diplomat and has represented Australia at a senior level in Indonesia, Singapore and Malaysia, and at the United Nations in Geneva and New York. She's passionate about the arts and was a board member at the substation in Singapore. Welcome, Penny.
Thank you. Makasih banyak sekali ya.
Terima kasih. And next we have Bapak Hikmat Darmawan. Selamat siang, Pak Hikmat.
Siang.
Pak Hikmat is the Deputy Director of Jakarta Arts Council. And Jakarta Arts Council is an autonomous body endorsed and funded by the province of Jakarta, whose role is to formulate policies for supporting and developing cultural activities in Jakarta. Pak Hikmat is also a film and literature critic and also a comic curator. Welcome, Pak Hikmat.
Hello, terima kasih. Thank you all, and it's nice to be here, and hope we have great conversation today.
Yes, thank you. And our third speaker is Bapak M. Taufiqurrahman, who is the editor-in-chief of the Jakarta Post. And the Jakarta Post is the daily English language newspaper in Indonesia. And he was previously joined as a political reporter. Selamat siang, Pak Taufik.
Selamat siang, Ibu Santi. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here with us. And next, I would like to welcome Elena Williams or Ellie from Canberra. Apa kabar, Ellie?
Baik, apa kabar?
Baik, terima kasih. And Elena is an international education and development practitioner with over 10 years experience in Indonesia and a very fluent Bahasa speaker as well. And Elena is a board member with DFAT Australia-Indonesia Institute currently, and also undertaking her doctoral studies at the Australian National University, examining the impact of study abroad programs on Australia-Indonesia relationship building and public diplomacy. Selamat datang, Elena.
Terima kasih.
And last but not least, we have Chloé Wolifson, who's joining us from Sydney. Hello, Chloé.
Hello, everyone.
Glad to have you with us. Chloé is an art writer, researcher, and a curator. She's also a contributor to the Sydney Morning Herald. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time. And let's start the conversation. And I would like to commence today by inviting each one of you to share with us some insights about your work and the position of your work globally and locally. How much have you considered the Australian-Indonesian relationship in your work context? And what can you tell us about that? And I would like to start with Elena.
Thank you for that, Ibu Santi. It's always a joy to go first. Hi, everybody. It's so lovely to see so many people here this afternoon, especially on a Saturday. So thank you all very much for giving up your time. Look, I think looking at the Australia-Indonesia relationship in the context of my work in particular, it's been a huge part of it. It's been very significant over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. Working in international education in particular, and with a lot of different youth groups between the Australia-Indonesia space, but also working with the UN and Oxfam and in development projects as well. There's been a real focus on developing people-to-people relationships between Australia and Indonesia. I think more recently, that was the work that led me to undertake my doctoral studies, which you've just mentioned, Santy, at ANU. So looking at the impact that study abroad in particular can have. So initiatives like the New Colombo Plan from DFAT, scholarship programs, that send young Australians over to Indonesia, trying to work out how we can actually measure what impact this has on people-to-people relationship building. And then, of course, looking at that in the context of other initiatives that are going on as well. So things like the Australia-Indonesia Youth Exchange Program, or IEP, which of course is one of our flagship programs from the Australia-Indonesia Institute, which we run every year. So looking at the way that the impact can be measured of these programs in people-to-people relationship building is a huge part of what I'm looking at in my research.
Yes. What do you think, in your experience, like the successful elements in cross-cultural relationship building, and what works in the Australian-Indonesian context?
Yeah, look, I think when we start to consider what works, it's a really good question and something to really think through. Certainly from my experience in education and in working with youth groups, as I mentioned, one of the things I would say that definitely works is structured and ongoing immersion. So really well-structured immersive programs and projects that have a kind of a level of flexibility that, formal components in there. So studying on campus, undertaking internships, things like that. But then also the flexibility to let students actually have informal learning opportunities as well. So traveling while they're there as well, or getting to know their host families if they're staying with host families, but really being able to immerse themselves into another culture. So from my experience previously working for the Australian Consortium for In-Country Indonesian Studies, or ACITU, we saw this when we were able to actually welcome students, whether it was for a program as short as 2 weeks all the way up to a full academic year, offering students the chance to actually attend classes, attend internships, and have these formal learning components, but then also informal opportunities alongside that. So they're actually, having the time to travel, having the time to make their own friends, having the time to live with Indonesians. And we see this also in other sectors. So for example, the Asialink arts residencies programs, where you'll have artists living in communities, and they're able to make those own networks and make those communities as well, which is a really big part of that as well. But I think having something that is scaffolded and structured is really important, and it's actually it enables a transformation that is deeper than simply traveling somewhere. You've actually got an activity to peg that to, which I think is very important for learning and transformation to take place.
Yeah, and you mentioned about impact, especially like personal. So what can you share with us about that?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that measuring impact in public diplomacy, in soft power initiatives, it can be quite difficult. In a sense, you're trying to measure the immeasurable. I mean, for a long time, I think there's been a lot of indicators and a lot of measurements that we've seen that are very quantitative. We know the numbers. So we know that we've seen, more than 40,000 students since 2014 under the New Colombo Plan travel to the Indo-Pacific region. 10,000 of those have studied in Indonesia, 5,000 of them have studied with the Chichis, and so on. The numbers look really good on paper. But what the numbers don't tell us, and this is the bit that I'm really interested in, what the numbers don't tell us is what that experience was like for that student, and in particular, what that experience was like for the host community in Indonesia that hosted them. So I think in a lot of the evaluations that we've seen, a lot of the literature, a lot of the media reports that we see about study abroad in particular, we're missing that student voice, we're missing that host community voice. And this is, of course, where that people-to-people relationship building work is really happening. It's in the kampungs, it's in the neighbourhoods, it's in the workplaces, it's on campuses. So if we're not actually hearing, the students and host communities' own versions of that and own definitions of what impact is, I think that's a qualitative measure that we're really missing and really lacking.
Yeah. That's a very good point, Ellie. Thank you so much. Now, I would like to ask Pak Hikmat Darmawan to share his experience.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think, of course, Australia and Indonesia have a really close relation. I remember that one of the most important movie in the history of cinema of Indonesia was the documentary by Joris Evans, Indonesia Calling. It's about the nationalists and Indonesian people in Australia and how they respond to the announcement of the proclamation of Indonesian freedom. It was in 1947, right? And I have one story that make me realize how important it is to have a further collaborative thing between us culturally. For example, I remember that I spoke with the late Mr. Amarzan Lubis. He's one of the senior journalists in Tempo, and he was a political prisoner in Suharto's era, but then upon his release, he was recruited by Tempo, and then he worked in Gatra and went back to Tempo. And during his time as a junior journalist and his affiliation with Communist Party (PKI) in Indonesia, he was also known as one of the leftist best poet, but I couldn't I couldn't read his work, of course, because the banning from Suharto era. Yeah. And I asked him where could I find because one of the interesting part is that Martin Aleida, another leftist writer, was informed me that once, I think it was in 1964, probably, Amarjan Lubis doing an experimental work, doing a journalistic work in the form of comics. So if I could find it, I can confirm it that it was before Joy Sako making a journalistic comic, but I couldn't find it, of course, everywhere. So I asked him about his poems and his work as a journalist in the form of comics, and he said that probably you could find it in Australia. So yeah, and I remember that it is a repeated story. Yeah, for example, even if it's not about political things, things about archiving, you know, one of the most important animator in Indonesia, Gatot Prakosa, the late Gatot Prakosa, also his works has been archived in Australia. And so I need to go Australia probably, yeah, to search those kind of things as a researcher in film area, and also in comics and animation. Probably I've got to find those archives. And I think nowadays we have young people really interested in doing archiving works and digging into past archives and so on, and try to structure it so everyone could access it, and also to create something from it. So I think it will be nice to have that kind of works and to develop more relationship culturally between Indonesia and Australia. But personally, as a researcher and also as a now in Jakarta Art Council, as a member of Jakarta Art Council, to deal with providing insight or helping Jakarta government to create a healthy policy for art policy in Jakarta, for example. So it's about kind of word, yeah, the rather unstructured world of creating artwork and making collaboration that more organic in terms of doing something artistically, and the other side to have a policy, a kind of a policy in all kind of levels to structure the, all those separate work in Jakarta. I find that I haven't really got a chance to work so much in developing some relationship in between me and my friend in Australia. But I found that there is a good possibility to develop something. For example, last year during the pandemic in Makassar Writer Festival, I spoke with one young artist who never been in Australia, I think, but she Dania Sita Dewi, yeah. It's in November 2020. It's a comic talk because Dania created a comic in a Japanese style from a folklore in Makassar about the relationship, the trade relationship, the traditional trade relationship between Makassar people and Aborigine people in Australia. So we talk about it and see how she collaborated with Sienna Stubbs, yeah, Aboriginal artist, to create that comic. So it's very global, yeah, in Makassar, in manga style, yeah, Japanese style, and about the past between Makassar and Australia, and we have quite a lot to talk about, and I think it's an interesting sample of how we could create some collaborative work between us.
Yeah, I think I'm also very interested in your work in policy seni as well. Maybe you can talk about policy seni and how you actually engage with communities that are outside the centers. So right. It would be something, I think, is it in visual arts?
No, it's about
right?
no, it's about so many different area of arts and more into the policy of art in Indonesia. So Indonesian Art Coalition or Koalisi Seni Indonesia is an organization that was developed probably in 2013 or 14, and I joined the group, the organization in 2015 at first as a as a deputy chief also, but then of course at the same time I was invited to join the Jakarta International Jakarta Art Council, so I kind of I have a double things to do, and now I continue in Jakarta Art Council, and informally I help Indonesian Art Coalition. So it's more about making a work on art policy in Indonesia, and one of the biggest work was to advocate, and actually it already happened in 2017, the law of cultural Indonesian cultural advancement, ya, undang-undang pemajuan budaya. So it is quite revolutionary, I think, because previously for the last probably 10 years or more, the ideas of making such a law was basically to control the culture, the development of culture. While actually the Indonesian Art Coalition advocating, and we had a close relationship with Hilmar Farid. At that time, he also the member of Indonesian Art Coalition, and at that time before he was appointed as Directorate Jenderal, ya, Directorate Jenderal in untuk kebudayaan, ya, for cultural general director in cultural ministry of Indonesia. So the ideas of the law now is that instead of controlling, we try to advance the culture of Indonesia, and it is in the spirit of Undang-Undang 45, ya. So our constitution. So now we have a law that actually try to advance the cultural expression, the art expression, and even try to have naungan hukum, to have like umbrella for the law, umbrella,
legal framework.
The legal framework for example, for the cultural funding, yeah, art funding in Indonesia. Now it is at work, but of course the pandemic kind of stunt the the process, but it is there in the law that we could actually have something more positive about culture, instead of years of frame of mind of controlling the influence from outside culture and so on. But now we can actually have something positive. Of course, that law in reality have to deal with other law that actually prohibited some degree of cultural expression in Indonesia. So it's still an ongoing process, and Indonesian Art Coalition still at work on that. Beside the work in cultural hotspot, creating cultural hotspot, and concentrating in the capacity building of artists in Indonesia to deal with the government issues and the government access for art funding.
Okay, interesting. So a lot of navigating tensions between, yeah. All right. Thank you, Pak Hikmat. We will continue later on. And I would like to ask Penny to share with us some insight about your work and the position of your work globally and locally, and how much have you considered the Australian-Indonesian relationship in your work context?
Thank you, Ibu Santy. That's a great question. So Asialink has actually been working to drive Australia's creative engagement with Asia for over 30 years. And Indonesia is actually one of our highest priority countries. So people always say to me, oh, Asialink, is that a think tank? Actually, the easiest way to explain what we do is we're a do tank.
I like that. Do tank, yes.
Yeah, we try and forge closer relationships between Australia and the countries in our region by doing three really important things. Number one is building insight or understanding, knowledge, and awareness. That's exactly what we're doing today. The second thing that we do is building capability. So the why, then the how do you show up? So things like intercultural capability. And then the third thing that we do is connections. So bringing together institutions and people, and we do that in many, many different ways. Asialink has programs in 4 areas. In arts, which is what we're doing today, but I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. In business, in education, and in something we call diplomacy, which is really about, policy and global affairs. And the work that we do with Indonesia spans all of those areas. So in our education foundation, for example, we currently work with over 200 schools in Indonesia in 18 different provinces, linking schools in Australia and schools in Indonesia, their educators, teachers, and students to actually to work together, to collaborate, to understand each other better. In our business arm, we're actually working very closely on the implementation of the Australia-Indonesia Closer Economic Partnership. Most of you would know that as Chapa. Working directly with business, trying to explain the opportunities in Indonesia, particularly under that new trade agreement, and how Australian business can work more closely with their counterparts to kind of deepen the economic relationship. In the area of diplomacy, we have very frequent dialogues between Australia and Indonesia at ministerial level and with others. And of course, in the arts, as Elena mentioned earlier, we have a long history of supporting Australians to go to Indonesia and experience the arts and culture sector. And our very contemporary focus is actually on building collaboration and exchange. So bringing people in the arts sector and in creative industries and cultural industries together to co-create actually new works, new insights, and to have this kind of dialogue. So I have to say we're very fortunate. We work on Indonesia and with Indonesia in so many incredibly important ways every day.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Penny. And I would like to touch on, I remember this is really based on some of our past conversation. This issue come up again about outdated ideas that we have between the two countries. And I think one way of having a better connection with each other is actually to eliminate those outdated ideas. And you mentioned about one of the key pillars that you do in Asialink is actually building intercultural capabilities. And what kind of capabilities do you think we need to build on to better engage with each other? And how do you measure? Like, what's the measurement?
Santy, great question. You're big on the data and the measurement. It's good to push on that question. Let me give a really small example of building intercultural capability. For example, the work that we do between schools. So one thing that is really vital for intercultural capability is actually just connecting in the first place. The second thing is actually developing what we call that global mindset, the idea and appreciation that somebody else's culture is fundamentally different to yours. And the third thing beyond the mindset is actually having that experience. So sharing our mutual experiences in ways that give openings into our culture. Let me give one concrete example. Australia and ASEAN held a virtual, one of the benefits actually of this very challenging time for all of us, a virtual youth forum with Australia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Singapore, which was focused on students, secondary school students, sharing their experience of the digital economy. And quite frankly, the Australian students, they were great, they were really passionate, they'd gone away and they'd researched Indonesia, but they had no understanding of just how incredibly sophisticated Indonesia is in the digital economy. And watching these young people come together in a forum like this and talking to each other about how they were actually engaging digitally, what they were doing with regard to their schoolwork, how they were actually connecting on issues, how they interacted in e-commerce platforms. When we say intercultural capability, we're not just talking about an abstract idea, we're talking about actually bringing people together to navigate these conversations on issues that matter to all of us.
Yeah.
Your question about measurement, how do we measure it? I'm going to share some sad data because I think a really important part of our collaboration is actually about language. And for Australians like myself and Elena, and many actually on this call, I can see so many friends here today. We have lived and worked in Indonesia. We speak Indonesian. And studying Indonesian is a deep mark of our respect and commitment to Indonesia and to your culture, because through language, you get such a fundamentally different level of insight and connection with people that really, really matters. But in Australia, our data and our most recent research by our Education Foundation shows that, in fact, Indonesian language learning is at the lowest level since 1972. I was born then, but only just. That is terrible. And for any policymakers who are on this call and any educationalists, I think for us to refocus on language capability is really important in taking forward anything that we want to do, including in the arts and culture sector. I'm just going to stop there, Santy.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Penny. And I'd like to mention ISCPA as well, that you brought up a bit. I think, so ISCPA is basically Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement that was finally signed in February 2020. And I think it was a very important, I think, change in the relationship between the two countries. And I remember the trade agreement focused, of course, on trade investment, education, climate change, and tourism. Unfortunately, there's no art sectors mentioned. But how do you think we can capitalize on this? Because one of this, I think this question is also related to Ellie, because under that agreement, Monash University can be one of the first foreign universities to be established in Indonesia. And then, we talk about language just now. So again, Penny, how do you think we can capitalize on the ISCPA?
So I'll make three really quick points. First of all, the commitment of our two governments to have both a comprehensive strategic partnership and a comprehensive economic partnership actually says to each other, this relationship is important, and we are committed to building that. And at the time of the conclusion or the signing of the Economic Partnership Agreement, IHEPA, Bapak President actually visited Australia.
Yes.
And that was an incredibly strong signal to both countries of the importance of the relationship. I had the honor of being in the Parliament in Australia when he gave an incredibly moving address about the need for us to strengthen our collaboration. So I think, first of all, our economic partnership is an expression of the importance of both governments attached to this relationship. The second thing is that while it might be disappointing that arts, culture and creative industries have not been a priority sector in the agreement, the agreement actually has several provisions that are very relevant for the arts and culture sector. And those include a reciprocal skills exchange, which actually allows, when we have, of course, reopened borders and moved past this very challenging time with COVID, but actually it provides for people with tertiary degrees to get up to 6 months work experience in each other's countries. And I think actually one of the issues here is the arts and culture sector don't look at the economic agreements, the trade agreements, and say, how are we going to use this? That to me is really interesting, the skills exchange. The second thing that is under there is a new $40 million 5-year cooperation program. And under that, there is a new vocational skills training initiative, which is expected to cover the creative economy. And so that is fantastic. The words creative economy are actually in the IHEPA. Yes. Yeah. So I think my third point here is the will is there, the opening is there, including particularly in skills exchange, which is what we're talking about here.
Yes.
Capability, reciprocity, traveling to each other's countries and experiencing. So I'm very optimistic that IHEPA can help facilitate some of those new connections, Ibu Santy.
Okay, that sounds really good. Thank you so much, Penny, for sharing.
Welcome.
And yes, and I'd like to move on to Pak Taufiq. Pak Taufiq, if you can share with us some insight about your work and the position of your work globally and locally, and how much have you considered the Australia-Indonesia relationship in your work context, please?
All right, thank you, Bu Santy, and thank you for inviting me for this seminar, joining the STEAM panel. I'm just going to talk about, from my perspective as sort of an observer, as a journalist working. The Jakarta Post considers itself as sort of a regional newspaper, although we're sort of a national newspaper in Jakarta or Indonesia. But we closely watch what is happening in the region, and I think Australia naturally comes to our view easily. And I think the practice for us in the newsroom is we tend to focus on crisis, on major developments. And I think if we see something bad happen in Australia, I think we see them with sort of a feeling of Schadenfreude, like when this may not be politically correct, but for instance, when you have the massive bushfire, and then we can feel superior, like, okay, this just doesn't happen in Indonesia. Okay, Australia, you also have that too. And then I think the last time when you have sort of the political crisis, like the 3 prime ministers in 3 years, we also see that as sort of, oh, okay, this is neighbor to the south having problem. And yeah, but I think journalists naturally see that major development as sort of point of interest. And also now we're seeing Australia sort of, and this is sort of the geopolitical situation in the region, Australia now having sort of a manage relationship with China, and we sort of waiting for sort of some fallout from that, and we see that with sort of bemusement because I think you should focus on Indonesia rather than China, for instance. But that's a geopolitical consideration, and we're waiting for something hopefully not too severe come from that, because I think that will impact negatively on the region. I think 2 years ago I saw this BBC interview with the Singaporean Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, predicting that something bad could happen with China. And I think all of us in the region, and particularly Australia and Indonesia, will sort of have a difficult position when it comes. Well, hopefully it doesn't happen, but this is something that we watch closely in the newsroom. And I think some of the panelists have mentioned about, but basically we in the newsroom consider this relationship of Indonesia and Australia is sort of traveling, but not really arriving, because there is just so much potential with Indonesia and Australia. I think Pak Hikmat early on mentioned about the support of Australian workers towards Indonesian independence. We have Prime Minister Menzies visiting UGM in '59, if I can remember correctly, and then we have 2 Indonesian presidents speaking to the parliaments, Pak SBY and Pak Jokowi recently. So this is, and also we have people-to-people relationship. I think on an annual basis, we in the newsroom receive a batch of students from ASISIS, and this is already part of the Jakarta Post program, and also. We see a lot of college universities in Australia having Indonesian Research Center with the language program. So I think on that note, we could have expected something bigger, something more rewarding coming out of the relationship. We have all the modalities, but and I think some of the panelists earlier mentioned about the SEPA, but the truth is, I think Indonesia is still like the number 13 in terms of trade partner, and the trade volume is not really that. It could have been better. So and also I think on a more grassroots level, we still have sort of I don't want to say misunderstanding, but I think this is more of a lack of understanding. I still remember the Lowy Research Center 2019. Most Australian think that, oh, Indonesia is not really a democracy. And at the same time, I believe most people in Indonesia, even if they have enough understanding about Australia, but this is mostly like viewing Australia with kind of suspicion, like and I think the trauma from East Timor's secession in 1999. I think this has left a deep mark in our psyche. Not necessarily myself, but most of Indonesian think that Australia play sort of a role in making that happen, and this is certainly the perception. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a large section of the Indonesian society who's really nationalists and sort of having protected the territorial integrity of Indonesia very strongly. So you have that perception as well. So I think the lack of understanding comes from both sides, and I think both sides needs to do a lot. And I think this kind of I read a book this is a book about Javanese Sufi mysticism. This is from George Quinn. I think you must have read this. This is the Bandit Saints. And I'm a Javanese, and I don't really understand too much about my own culture. And I've got a lot of stuff from George Quinn's book about how Islam meets Buddhism and Hinduism in Java. And I think we have a lot of people like George Quinn in Australia, and it will be it's going to be a tremendous advantage for a nation to read those kind of books, and knowing that there's a lot of Australian doing a lot of work on Indonesia, and it is easily accessible to Indonesia. And also, I think we can rely a lot on popular culture to sort of, give Indonesian better understanding of Australia. I know this may not sound like an ideal example, but I think, and this is because I stayed at home too much. I watch Operation Buffalo. Yeah, this is Operation Buffalo, about the nuclear test site in Maralinga or somewhere. Yeah, and I think I know more about Australian politics under Menzies more than by reading history books, and also watching Glitch, for instance, which is easily accessible thanks to Netflix. But I think that's kind of sort of the cultural exchange that we need to see more coming from Australia. So, and because I think we all agree that the powerful impact of pop culture, and probably the easier dissemination of works from George Quinn and any other Indonesianist from Australia. So yeah, I think that's sort of my initial impression about the relationship between the two countries.
Yeah. Thank you, Pak Taufiq. Very, very interesting issues there. You mentioned about the relationship between Australia and Indonesia at the moment, that you think is still kind of traveling, not arriving yet. So what do you think the role of the media or the press in promoting, or strengthening further engagement between these two countries?
Yeah, I think, with countries like Japan or the United States, I think we know what to expect in terms of its relationship with, or their relationship with Indonesia. With Australia, I think there's a lot to be desired from its relationship, and I think for us in the media, I think what we can do best is sort of bring more good news from Australia, of course. And I think, well, now we watch with great interest what happened in Australia with the government's plan to sort of rein in Facebook and Google, and I think we can learn a lot from that also. And this is from the Indonesian side of the media industry. But I think the exchange of information, the free flow of information between Australia, I think the cultural exchange can also be extended to journalists, and I think in the newsroom we have done that as well with the Assisi's program. So yeah, I think we need to tell more stories from Australia, and this is from my side. And also I think there's the need for Australian media to sort of cover Indonesia differently, and probably not just to focus too much on Bali or some of the crises that we have, the phone tapping incidents. Of course, let's make a good drama, but that's not really, the whole point of the relationship. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Pak Taufiq. I'd like to move on to Chloé. Hi, Chloé. If you can share with us some insight about your work and the position of your work globally and locally, and how much have you considered the Australian-Indonesian relationship in your work context, please?
Well, thank you, Santy. First of all, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Cadigal and Wangal lands in Sydney, and pay my respects to all First Nations people and anyone here present. Yeah, I mean, I guess I come at this from a pretty sort of grassroots level, as somebody who is looking at and writing about art, at the moment, primarily in Sydney, and, in the past, I have had the opportunity to sort of extend that to, some press trips in Southeast Asia. But I guess, obviously in Australia, we have, from a visual arts perspective, which is sort of where I'm coming from, obviously there's, more formal and larger sort of structural things in place, like the Asia Pacific Triennale, which has, been going for a very long time now. But in more recent years, and I think, last week in your conversation, Margaret Moore spoke about this a little bit as well, but commercial galleries and sort of philanthropists and individuals who have an interest, in Indonesia have sort of facilitated those exchanges for themselves. And I, as somebody engaged in the industry have encountered, you know, Indonesian artists through that. And, you know, through my work in a commercial gallery, my previous job, encountered that through an Australian artist who had undertaken a residency in Indonesia, for example, and collaboration with Indonesian artists had arisen through that. And that, you know, and there are various examples in Sydney of, you know, different commercial galleries and independent spaces organising exhibitions and public programs, you know, off their own back, you know, through that through their own interest. And, you know, I think, you know, the previous panelists have all, you know, spoken about these really important kind of more formal structures that are in place. And I guess, you know, I'm sort of at the, the other end of that. And I think it is important to think about how those more organic and informal exchanges take place that sort of trickle down, I suppose, from those interactions. And so, yeah, that's one aspect of that for me that I think is really important is, you know, having the opportunity to go to exhibitions and, you know, hear from artists and gallerists who, you know, have, who are able to kind of share that information. And I think art, you know, is one of the ways that we get those, you know, just like language, like Penny was saying, art is another way that, you know, as adults, if we haven't had the opportunity to immerse ourselves in a culture previously, art gives us insights into all sorts of other aspects of other cultures. And so I think it is, you know, for me, you know, just on that really sort of basic level, a really important part of my job. And yeah, I think as far as, you know, sort of going further into those interactions, when I have pre-COVID have the opportunity to go to art fairs in, not in Indonesia yet, unfortunately, but in Singapore and in the Philippines. And though I think, you know, art fairs are a particular beast, and they were spoken about a little bit last week on the panel as well. But, you know, I think any of those large scale events, even the APT, but also, you know, art fairs and biennales, you know, they become a hub around which other activities in a city take place. And so even though arts writers like myself might be sort of given that opportunity to visit that particular art fair and report on it, it opens up so many opportunities to engage with the local art scene there, meet artists, other writers, gallerists, and also, you know, within those art fairs themselves, there are often I guess non-commercial exhibitions in which an artist is given an opportunity to kind of spread their wings and produce a piece of work that's not so much, you know, part of a gallery stall. So, you know, there's so many ways in which I guess, you know, just from thinking about, you know, those small interactions that I've had, you know, the opportunities that those exchanges generate. And every time I speak to an artist or research an artist in the course of writing about their work, it teaches me a little more about their world and equips me further to, and, you know, as well as, you know, giving me more desire to engage with their world. And so, yeah, I guess for me, I'm really interested in the possibilities there. You know, of course, COVID, you know, puts a dampener on, you know, the idea of travel. But I think, you know, even I've written, you know, many exhibition essays for artists over the course of COVID. And, you know, we haven't necessarily been able to do studio visits and things like that. But just the, you know, the opportunity is still there to have conversations and to learn about each other's practices. And yeah, I think there's definitely, you know, so much that can be generated through that. So yeah, and I guess that's speaking about it as well from the point of, arts writing, in the context of arts-specific publications. And then, I have a little bit of experience as well writing for a newspaper. So yeah, but Taufiq also sort of covered that. So yeah.
Yes. No, thank you, Chloe. I think this issue of access to information and knowledge, especially in visual art, has come up in our past conversation again and again. So it's very, very crucial. I think we have a lot of questions already, and I would like to actually pass on to hand it over to Pipa to ask more questions to our panelists. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Santy. Wow. We have flown through this session so far. We're going to bring back all the panelists into one group. I do recommend that if you're in the audience to use speaker view. Thank you so much for sharing. That were very interesting backgrounds and contributions to the conversation. Have I got everybody? Yes. I'm interested, I'm going to pass to some questions in a moment. We've had quite a number from the audience. But before we do that, I think there's been some very interesting comments arising around the organic versus a more structured approach. And I'm trying to, I guess, understand what some of the similarities and differences are between Australia and Indonesia in terms of how we work, how we set policy, and how we engage more broadly. And of course, in this COVID, I'm not going to say post-COVID, because we're very sorry to hear the situation in Indonesia at the moment. And we hope that all of you here today are feeling safe and well. But we do acknowledge that it has had an enormous impact there. So the ways that we are working are very different. In some respects, we're connecting more fluidly like this and being more inclusive like this. But in other ways, I'm wondering how it might have changed the relationships and the ability to connect and communicate. So focusing on this sort of more organic structure versus a structured one, Pak Hikmat, you were describing to me cross-cultural projects that you're doing in Indonesia, from Jakarta out to Sulawesi. I would like to hear more about this, and building on as well, Pak Taufiq's comments about the importance of cross-cultural understanding. So with COVID, are we becoming more hyper-local in our focus rather than international? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, me first, yeah, probably.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that I've just realized hearing from Taufiq presentation earlier that I think one of the problem of Indonesia and Australia is that we both looking toward America and China, not toward each other more. So I think that's how we define our relationship. We measure ourselves and our relationship in as a part of the global theater that have a center in America or China. So, for example, in creative industry, many of our young directors, for example, dream about making it in America or Europe. Not really looking forward to make something with Australian people or Australian audience or Australian creators. And that's why it is interesting that it was really interesting for me to have a chat in 2019 with one of the Australian artists, comic artist actually, who recently just completed his doctoral thesis in the form of comics, Bruce Muttard. And in 2019, we met in UK, of all places, and he said about the ideas of making a comic festival or comic art conference between the artists in Asia Pacific or in Pacific area. So it will be interesting to have all kind of artists from not only from Jakarta and Sydney or Melbourne, but also artists, comic artists in Makassar, for example, in Lombok. There is a little but interesting development there in Palu, and also with Papua, with Timor, with all of the artists, and just gather together or gathering our works together, and have a collaborative program, collaborative exhibition, for example, in one platform. And of course, now during the pandemic, I can see that beside the problem of pandemic, the limitation resulted by the pandemic, we have also seen the opportunity to have more communication with each other because of the digital platform that we use today. And so, of course, the artistic experience of visiting the virtual exhibition, for example, is not really as good as visiting the physical exhibition, but we have the opportunity to introduce the works and the knowledge about our creative output together in this digital platform. So I think there is an opportunity there to work toward a more organic collaborative program, and it is also what I'm doing now during the pandemic, to say hi, to say hello to the artists that or the art workers in outside Jakarta, outside Java, in Riau, in the jungle. Actually, we were having some collaborative program before the pandemic, and I have to visit the place in the jungle, 5 hours from the capital city of Riau, 2 hours on car, and 3 hours on boat. And we have in Indonesian Art Coalition, we have a program called Cultural Hotspot, and that's one of the project in Rimbang Baling jungle. And we have an artist from comic artist, mural artist, music artist from Jakarta, from Bogor, from Yogyakarta, and we brought them to the jungle and work together with the indigenous people in there to have something together in their village. And after that, the artists from Jakarta, for example, making comic, for example, Sheila Roswita making comic about that journey, that travel, that experience, and introduce us to the strange world for Jakartan people, you know, of the jungle in Riau. And so we did a lot of that before the pandemic, but we could focus on the communication side of that collaborative work, organic collaborative work between islands in Indonesia, and why not between 2 countries or more, yeah, 2 or more countries. As long as the idea is as long as we could look each other more instead of, you know, focusing on our dream on making it in America or in in China and so on. So I think that's one of the first steps that we could develop organically, and then we could structure it. I believe that we could do both, but I believe that we have to begin with the more organic approach about this collaborative opportunity.
Thank you. It really sounds to me that you are, in the true sense of the word, facilitating.
Yeah.
Not controlling, but facilitating and enabling organic interactions, which I think is, you know, a very special way of working, actually. Ellie, can I ask you to respond or add some views of your own there?
Yeah, look, I think this is a really, really interesting topic to be looking at, and quite timely, obviously, given the pandemic. And, you know, I talked earlier about the importance of immersive experiences and getting to know each other by sort of going there. COVID has certainly challenged that notion of going there and how we get to know each other when we can't travel, you know, when we can't have these sort of structured experiences, but then the informal sideline experiences that they also facilitate. So one of the things that I think has been really, you know, fascinating but really rewarding to watch over the summer just gone has been, you know, Taufiq, you mentioned earlier the summer at Chi-Chi's interns that would normally go into the Jakarta Post. You know, this year we saw all of the Chi-Chi's study programs over, you know, December to February, from 2-week study programs in language learning to 6-week internships in journalism and business and agriculture, and a public health study tour as well. We saw these actually run virtually for the first time. So this was, you know, this was a huge feat. I think there were a lot of people who may have been a little skeptical at the beginning. You know, how do you actually run a study abroad program if it's online? But what we actually saw in doing this was it was building this kind of, you know, what Penny described earlier, the intercultural capability, but also the technical know-how, which is just as important. So this was a really organic way of responding, I think, to what happened through something that's normally a very formal program, very structured. But what you saw as well along the way was students actually meeting other students, chatting with their colleagues through their work placements, and getting to know each other through WhatsApp groups and through FaceTime. And there were real gains being made there as well. And a similar experience was also happening alongside in the Australia-Indonesia Youth Exchange Program, or IEP, that I mentioned earlier. So in this program, normally you'd have 18 Indonesians come to Australia from October to December. You'd have 18 Australians go to Indonesia from December to February with the Indonesians as well, so as a big group. You'd have this whole group, and instead, of course, this year no one could travel. So this was also a bit of an experiment in what would that look like if we ran this online. So again, taking what I was describing earlier as a sort of structured or scaffolded program where things were built into this, such as a formal mentorship program, an internship program. There was, you know, every week there were themed Zoom topics, webinars on gender equality, webinars on Australia-Indonesia relations and the history of it, the Australia-Indonesia political relationship, education, and so on. And so you'd have these kind of, you know, these 2 hours on Zoom each day. But then again, what was really interesting was the relationships that fostered and how they actually then gained a momentum of their own. So delegates who were then chatting with each other on WhatsApp, chatting with each other's families, you know, showing someone on FaceTime, oh, this is the beach near where my house, near where I live, or this is my family, and this is, I'm eating bakso for lunch. What's bakso? You know, these sort of moments which seem trivial, but are all part of that kind of rich tapestry of people-to-people relationship building. So I think it's been really wonderful to see that that's actually able to continue despite the pandemic. And certainly, you know, I don't think we're going to be traveling anytime soon, sadly. So to have had such an effective and successful trial run over this summer, I think it actually paves the way for a lot of innovation in study abroad programs more broadly.
Thanks, Sally. And I think you really just touched a nerve with me around the so-called or seemingly trivial and how we trivialize, you know, things that are actually very important parts of our day-to-day experience. And I mean, I think that's the, you know, the concern we have in the arts and cultural sector, right, is that it's often trivialized or marginalized or sidelined as not being about the hard, not being important and front of mind. Taufiq, I'd love to hear your views on how you think things are really changing during this period of time and what we've been experiencing over the last 12 months.
Okay. Yeah, I think what, and this is, I speak from my experience in the newsroom watching the COVID situation in Australia. And whenever we hear another announcements, okay, the lockdown will continue for another 3 months. And because we monitor that closely and we can see the reaction, and this is from our platform, from our website. This information from Australia are mostly the most viewed, the most read information from our website. And I think I can see this as sort of a reflection of, I think it is safe to say that there's a large section of Indonesian mothers and fathers who expect to send their kids this year to Australia, and they're anxiously waiting for when the border will reopen, and they follow this closely. And okay, another 6 months, another year of Zoom class session. So yeah, it's challenging, and I think the direct people-to-people context, I think this is irreversible. And I think the experience from Aziz is we have a tradition at the post when the internship is over, we bring all the participants to, because next to the Jakarta Post office there's a Rumah Makan Padang. This is a Padang restaurant, and we always bring them to Rumah Makan Padang to have Padang food, and where when we have conversation about what are their experience, what are they commenting on the what food they have. And I think most of them said that this is the most valuable experience, having to be in Jakarta, especially in Jakarta. This is like a really special experience for them. Whenever I ask them what is your impression on your stay in Jakarta, because this is really an alien place to them, and they have a tremendous amount of experience being in Jakarta. So I think and I believe this is also what parents in Indonesia are expecting to have their kids when they are in Australia as well, because I believe a large section of Indonesian society, sort of, some of them are really, I have to say, westernized, and they look to Australia as sort of the incarnation of this entity, and this is very proximate. This is in its proximity. So I think this is what Indonesian parents can get, like the closest to the Western culture. So I think if we can keep that interaction freely, and I suppose this is going to be post-COVID. So, and we can go back to sort of the normal situation. I think it's something we can look forward to. Yeah, the sooner the better.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Just jumping back to you. We've been discussing immersion and the capability, and what I'm interested in around your work and observations. Is this an opportunity to really look at as well diaspora artists in Australia if we're trying to continue international engagement, or how do you see it? What are the viewing rooms actually like in terms of an experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's, of course, it's not ideal, viewing things that are intended for an in-person experience in a viewing room. But like any exhibition or experience, it creates an opportunity to sort of generate conversations. I think, in terms of diaspora engagement, the museums have a really important role to play there, and they've started to do that in terms of activating their existing collections, and also looking to diversify their collections to sort of, I guess, better reflect the makeup of the various multitudes of diasporas we have in Australia. And those things have changed over time, those collections, based on museum directors, curators, various interests, all of those things. So I guess, it's an opportunity, there's always an opportunity for audiences to really, I guess, challenge those institutions to and hold them to account so that their collections do better reflect what's around them. And I think, they're picking up the ball and doing that fairly well, considering it's, I mean, yeah, it's, yeah, there's, I think I've seen some really interesting examples of, using an existing collection as a jumping off point to really engage with what's happening in the contemporary art sector, and further to that, building public programs around that engage the community and bringing people into galleries who wouldn't normally, feel that it was a place for them or see themselves reflected in it. And yeah, I think that is that's one really important role that museums have in our society. And they're a formal institution, and they do they're funded by taxpayers. So yeah, there's a responsibility there, I suppose, but it does then trickle down to a much more organic kind of exchange at the grassroots level as well.
Thank you so much, because we have had this discussion over the course of the last few weeks in regard to the role that institutions play and the difference in institutional collecting between Australia and Indonesia in the visual arts sector. And the capability development, I guess, but the differences in the way that Indonesia works. But I really love that there has been a thread throughout that it's a very diverse ecosystem. We need all parts to be functioning at the same level to really make and shift the dialogue further forward. And I love what you said about an institution or a collection being a springboard, in much the same way that Pak Hikmat talks about the archive being a springboard and a point of connection into narrative as well. There is a question, Penny, that I thought maybe I would throw to both you and Pak Taufiq, actually. And Chaitanya from ANU is with us. So wonderful to have you, Chaitanya here today. I wondered if we might unmute you to ask this question. Would that be possible?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, welcome.
Hi. Hi. Oh, thank you very much for the opportunity to ask this question. I was really struck by remarks from Hikmat and Taufiq in relation to the fact that the arts and culture sectors tend to have more or less left-leaning sympathies in different parts of the world. Australia and Indonesia are also part of this situation. And there is a particular history around 1965-66 with the persecution of the left, and Australia's role during the Cold War, and the complicity, I suppose, that Australia has in standing by while tremendous genocidal violence takes place in Indonesia. So I'm wondering whether there's actually a longer history to a sense of unease that stretches back perhaps all the way to Bandung.
Thanks, Chaitanya. Pak Taufiq, would you like to respond first and then Penny?
So yeah, probably I'm not the best person to answer this, but yeah, I think I think it's pretty obvious that after 65, we barely have sort of the leftist expression in the country, and I think I still remember correctly, and this is around 98 when there's an art exhibition in Jogja, and I think this is for the first time. There's a permission granted to a sort of formerly leftist artist, and it was a huge deal in 98. And I think this is sort of a description of the length to which the leftist expression has been suppressed in Indonesia. And pasca reformasi, after reformasi, this sort of now it's coming back to the center stage. So yeah, and of course, as part of the Cold War theater, I think Australia sort of have to take side in this. So I believe some of the things that you have mentioned could be true, because yeah, this is sort of the consequences of the Cold War. But I think that's kind of a real sentiment. I don't know if Pak might want to add something to that. Yeah.
Penny, would you like to jump in and then maybe Pak Hikmat?
Yeah. Sure, Pippa. I think it's a really excellent question, and I feel as though to do it justice, I probably need, 2 hours rather than 2 minutes, to be frank. But I think first of all, it's a really powerful question, because so few people on either side, to be honest, have a deep understanding and granular insight into these periods of history, and into the impact on the bilateral relationship between Australia and Indonesia of these moments in each other's history. So I would say the first thing I would like to say is actually holding up some of these moments to scrutiny and asking about their impact on the relationship, which I would agree with Pat Taufiq, feels like it's on a journey but has not yet arrived, despite all the effort that has been put in at the government-to-government level. Beginning to understand and better analyze some of the history there is going to help us on the journey. Secondly, I would say one of the fundamental differences, and again, something that many Australians don't understand, is Indonesia's stance as generally as a non-aligned country. It's been very different to Australia's stance, which has long been as part of the Western Alliance and very much so in an alliance relationship with the United States. And that has obviously been a key dynamic. While, you know, it's not a barrier to bilateral cooperation, very important to understand that that means we have very different drivers in our foreign and security and sometimes economic policy. The third point I would make is for all the points at which our relationship has been strained, perhaps by those political differences, there have been moments that we've come together really powerfully in collaboration, which kind of give maybe a different depth to the relationship, and I think a cyclical sense to the relationship. So, you know, the coming together that Bapak President Pak Jokowi talked about in his speech in the Australian Parliament, you know, basically Australia was there following the tsunami in trying to help support Indonesia. Indonesia was actually helping support Australia in some profoundly valuable ways at the time of the bushfires. So for all the points of tension that we might have because of those differences, there are also some incredibly inspiring points at which we've come together in collaboration over the history of our bilateral relationship. So I'll just stop there. Thanks, Pippa, and thanks for a brilliant question.
Pak Hikmat, did you want to respond as well? And I'm going to just say we have very limited time left, so a short response, please.
I try to be fast.
Yeah, I agree with Penny. Of course, there are some tension, and I remember all about the tension. In particular, for example, early 2000, there was a tension about how Australian sent the movie about Balibo and how Indonesian government at that time react on it. But at the same time, we see that the young people, the audience, the communities of creators accept that movies and accept the possibility, the opportunities to talk about that issues, the taboo issues in Indonesian politics. So I think I want to highlight in this limited time the strategic position of the collective artists and writers that have a leftist leaning in Indonesia, for example, to have a more freedom to interact and interact more freely with Australian artists, fellow Australian artists, independent and underground artists. For example, the punk artist, I don't remember where, Atong, already developed in 1990s the punk comics and was distributed into the punk shop in Australia also. So that kind of thing will be a strategic initiation for the more structured collaboration between Indonesian art communities and artists and Australian art communities and artists. And also in movies we can see, because as I said earlier, the industry, the directors, the movie maker that have a dream to make it big in Hollywood doesn't really look forward to making something with Australian creators. But the communities, the independent directors could always have that opportunity to and excited about the possibility of creating a network with Australian. For example, one of the senior independent artists, Gary Nugroho, always have a collaborative work with Australian artist community. So the younger people in the collective and the more informal community, usually in opposition with the mainstream or with the state, could always have a more free approach to these opportunities between us.
Thank you so much. I note that we've had some very interesting comments, and we will be saving and sharing these through this report writing process I mentioned. We're actually out of time, so I'm going to ask if we had 20 seconds each for one thing that you might take away from this, or that we could explore in a deeper regard in terms of transferring this knowledge to the arts and cultural sector to build stronger bridges between Australia and Indonesia. What would that one thing be? 20 seconds, Chloe, I know you've got some great ideas.
I think just any opportunity to bring artists and writers together to have conversations and to give artists the opportunity for a writer to engage with their practice, and the mutual, I guess, insights that can be generated through those exchanges. So any opportunities to connect artists and writers and to have that writing put out into the world somehow.
Thank you so much. And I'll add to that there has been a lot of commentary about Indigenous exchange, First Nations exchange. This is really very interesting. So maybe there's a potential to explore that concept too, Chloe. Thank you so much. Penny? I might be on mute.
Unmute before you open your mouth. My really quick observation as a former diplomat and government official is, quite frankly, keeping on with our efforts to elevate arts and culture as being a key part of the relationship, with policymakers, so that they understand that funding arts and culture, privileging arts and culture, and really deepening those people-to-people connections is what can build a highly effective, far deeper and far richer relationship. And to Pat Taufik's point, move us along in the journey. So that would be, my point. Let's just keep the agenda right up there and help policymakers and governments recognize how valuable collaboration is in arts and culture.
Wonderful. Thanks, Penny. Hikmat?
Yeah, I think what we do here with this digital platform could serve as a document also that would have a strategic value in the future for our shared knowledge and even art performance, documenting art performance. For example, now many of the government events have to change into the digital platform, and it could serve as a wide variety of art documentation in Indonesia, Indonesian art document in the form of visual or digital platform. And it could serve as a base for our future collaborative strategic program in art and culture.
Great idea. Thank you so much. And it builds on some concepts that have been discussed in the previous session. So that's perfect. Thank you. Taufiq?
Oh, okay. I'm a big believer on pop culture. So, well, we can expect more of an export from Australia in terms of pop culture. I know from experience, a lot of indie musicians from Australia is big in Jakarta. So I think you should, send more, you should do more to sort of send that cultural product, pop culture. I think we can start with the fine art later, but you can start with the pop culture. This is the easiest to disseminate first. So yeah, looking forward to hear more Tame Impala or more Glitch on Netflix.
Thank you. And that builds on some very good comments from Diane in the chat around K-pop and the strength of that. And we all know their power. And Ellie, last but not least.
Thank you. I would just go back to, I think telling stories of achievement and telling stories that highlight what's going on in the relationship that people otherwise wouldn't know about. So you touched on something before as well, Pippa, you know, which also kind of bugs me, that people, there's this misconception, I think, that soft power or public diplomacy, people-to-people relationship is the tokenistic sort of approach. It's the easy option. And I would agree with Penny that I think we need to actually spotlight this work and celebrate it. You know, this is, you know, it takes work to build these relationships, and it takes consistent, dedicated sort of persistence from a bunch of people who genuinely want to make a difference. So I would say to, you know, to echo Taufiq's comments before as well, getting these messages out into the media, into the mainstream media, is a big part of that. Seeing some positive news about Australia-Indonesia relationships, that's always a nice story to see. But celebrating those achievements, I think, while we can't travel, amplifying those messages through social media, using your diaspora and using your alumni and champion networks, I think is a really key way forward.
Thank you so much. It really does paint a very powerful picture, especially when we have incredible leaders like yourselves. All of you in different ways are really helping to influence and shape this relationship in a very positive way. And I feel very optimistic actually right now, based on everything that you've shared and all the participation and commitment of our audience today who have stayed with us the whole time. Thank you so very much. I'm going to hand to Santy to wrap up. Please don't go, just a minute or two. Thank you, Santy.
Thank you, Pippa. And, you know, on behalf of Santy Saptari Consulting and Asialink Art, thank you so much for taking the time to join our last conversation today. It's been such a great journey. It's been fun to organize all these conversations, and thank you to all the speakers for sharing your knowledge and experiences and bringing such an insightful and joyful conversation. I think that's important. And thank you for all of you who have been very, very committed in participating in this series. We will compile the key findings from all the different conversations and publish a report, so stay tuned for that. And we will also be publishing the recording of the 4 conversations. So before we go, we like to do a photo session. This is one of our favorite parts in Indonesia. So my colleague, Danang, can you help us to count?
Yeah. If we all switch to gallery view, and if you're around, please turn on your camera. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you.
Okay, I will count 1, 2, 3, and then I will capture the picture, okay? 1, 2, 3. One more. 1, 2, 3. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Are you done? Dana? Yes?
Thank you. Yes.
All good? All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please stay safe to all of our friends, family and colleagues in Indonesia, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Please do feedback to us any further questions you might have.
Yes, have a good weekend, everyone.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.